So what we're here to talk about is exactly what we just introduced, is the fact that Chinese companies are going global right now in a very big way. And I think it's creating a lot of questions in the West about what the motivations are behind these firms. Are they commercially oriented? Are they government motivations? Are they ready to go overseas? So it's one thing for them to aspire to go global, but are they really ready to commercially execute? So we'll talk about these and many other areas as we go throughout today's presentation. What I'd like to do before we begin is actually start looking at how Western multinationals or European multinationals have adapted their approach to international markets in recent years. So first, when many companies were looking outside of North America and Western Europe, they were primarily looking at the BRICS, or markets like Brazil, Russia, India, and China. When they were going there, it was primarily to look for markets for growth. They were trying to get as much market share as possible without actually trying to get profit. What ended up happening, though, is there were some very tough economic times here in Europe, also in the United States, and many of these companies needed to shift their focus. It was no longer about just entering these markets, it was about making a profit as well. And the way this translated in Asia was in China, you're starting to see much more of a push inward, so expanding beyond Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and really going into second and third tier cities to further penetrate the market. Additionally, these companies are now looking into markets in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, whether that be Indonesia, Vietnam. And I think this is very interesting because when I worked in Asia and I meet with my clients who are kind of general managers for Asia Pacific sitting in a market like Shanghai, I typically ask them, what market is most important for you outside of China and Asia? And many times I hear from them, for my business, China is Asia. And I think now I never see that anymore. I think people are always looking at it from a much more of a portfolio standpoint. So beyond the way that Chinese companies, or the way that American and European companies view these markets, it's also changed the way that we view China itself. I think we all got used to China as the world's factory and China as the producer. And we're all kind of used to buying products that are made in China. But more and more we're starting to see the realization of the consumer market in China, and something that a lot of Western firms went to China seeking many years ago, and they didn't quite see then, but they're certainly seeing now. What you see in the middle is an image from a company you've heard of in the news recently, Alibaba. They have a Tmall platform, which is their B2C platform. Last year, within 24 hours, they had a special sales event. And within 24 hours, about $5 billion US were spent, which is remarkable by any means, and it really highlights the consumption power within the economy today. So we've seen the progression of China from a producer to a consumer, but more and more we're seeing Chinese companies as competitors and global competitors at that. And these are just a few of the companies that we'll talk about today, and I've kind of highlighted in my book. As you look at the companies, though, and you look at Chinese companies with how much of a competitive threat they play, it's really starting to increase. We organized a breakfast for about 40 senior executives in Shanghai in April, and we asked them several questions about what was going to be the biggest factor that was going to impact their ability to hit their targets in 2014. And 41% of them said Chinese competition. It was the number one response they gave. And I think 2-3 years ago, that wouldn't be the answer they would have given. So the question we want to ask today is, what does this mean for us from a host country? What does this mean from us as a company that's potentially going to partner or compete with them? And then what does it mean for everyday consumers and everyday people in the countries where Chinese companies are investing? And so to do that, I want to look at 4 key questions that we'll talk about in detail in today's conversation. So first is the motivations. So why are Chinese companies going global? Is it because the government's telling them to do so, or is it because there's a very clear business case that makes sense for them and their business? How ready are they, and what are the relationships they need to get right in order to successfully expand overseas? What approach are they taking? Chinese companies can take many approaches to go global. They can partner with another organization through a joint venture, they can acquire another company, or they can place their own greenfield investment for the first time. And last, we'll look at the impact. So what are the costs, but then also what are some of the potential benefits of Chinese investment in a market like Ireland or in other international markets? So why are Chinese companies going global? The environment that Chinese companies are operating in has changed dramatically. And while I think a lot of what we talk about when we talk about Chinese companies going global is the 走出去 or the go out policy, there is a true business purpose and a true set of business motivations that is encouraging Chinese companies to go global. And that really brings me to one of our key points today, which is Chinese companies are going global for a combination of both government and business-driven motivations. And the reason behind this is that the environment that many of these Chinese companies developed in is very different from where it is today, whether you're looking 10, 20, 30 years later. The costs of doing business have increased substantially, whether you look at wages, whether you look at energy. It's also become extremely competitive. It's not just other Chinese companies they're competing against, but it's also other Western companies. It's companies from Europe, companies from the US. So because of this, there are a number of factors that just make pure business sense for why a Chinese company wants to go overseas. From a government perspective, I want to talk about just about three main reasons here that are kind of attached more to the going out policy. So these are things such as creating national champions that are able to compete on the international stage, companies that are able to further spread the soft power of China as a nation through their international investments. Next, China's sitting on I think it's around $4 trillion US dollars in foreign exchange reserves. So investing in Chinese state-owned enterprises and their efforts to expand overseas is more of a controllable way for them to get that money outside of China. And through that process, they're able to gain access to resources and minerals and things that were probably a part of the earlier push to go global that helps sustain the economy back home in China. But that said, there's also some very real business motivations for why Chinese companies want to go global. They want advanced technology to help give them an upper hand, not just internationally, but to be able to better compete domestically with their peers. They want management best practices and global best practices for managing their businesses that they're just not used to having in a domestic environment. So to give you an example, one of the individuals I interviewed for my book was a Harvard-educated psychologist who was originally from China, but obviously has studied overseas. And she was brought in to manage the integration after the Lenovo-IBM merger back in 2005. At that time, she was working directly with the CEO of Lenovo. His name was Bill Amelio. He's a former IBM executive, an American. He came in and he said that he felt that half the people on his management team were really top talent. He thought they were global talent. He wanted to keep them on his team. But he thought the other half just didn't have the skills. He didn't really understand why they were on his management team. And quite frankly, he wanted to fire them. But he knew from speaking with her that it would have ramifications throughout the company beyond just the senior management team if he let them go. So they worked together to come up with an interesting solution that kind of helped everybody save face. So what they did was they came up with two levels of senior vice president. There was a senior vice president 1, or SVP 1, that was given to people that essentially already had the skills and were already at what he deemed to be global management at a global management level. And then at the same time, there was a Senior Vice President 2, or an SVP 2. And this title was given to people that had a very clear mandate that they had work to do. Either they had to upskill their capabilities and move up in the organization, or they'd have to eventually find a new job. But the reason why this was creative was because externally to friends and family, they could go around and say, I'm a Senior Vice President at Lenovo, whether they were a Senior Vice President 1 or 2. So this creative way of blending a global management practice kind of and meshing it to Chinese nuances is just one example of some of the things you'll see as you look at some of the more challenges that come during that kind of post-merger integration phase, which for any set of companies can be very difficult, but what we see with Chinese companies and Western companies can be increasingly difficult. We also see acquisitions and expansion overseas to get global brands. We've seen examples such as the Weetabix acquisition, such as Medion with Lenovo. And some of these acquisitions are being made not just to help them expand internationally, but it helps them sell their products at a more premium level. Another example is a company called Pearl River Piano. They're a small piano company outside of southern China. And what they did was they wanted to enter the United States market, but they wanted to use a brand that kind of carried a bit more prestige. So rather than just go into the United States with their own brand, they went and they found a company in Germany called Rittmüller, and it was a company that's been in existence for years and had a very strong heritage for producing high-quality pianos. And so what they did was they purchased the brand license for Rittmüller and then sold Rittmüller pianos in America as a high-end brand, and then their own Pearl River brand as a low-end brand. So it allowed them to enter the market and gradually build their brand awareness for an American market without necessarily having to worry about spending years and millions of dollars to build its own brand just more organically. And then last, Chinese companies are looking to go global to enter new markets. They need to diversify into other markets the same way any other company needs to diversify outside of their domestic economy. We're already seeing things like the steel industry. There's tremendous overcapacity. So on one hand, this is challenging for them back in China, but there are other opportunities potentially in other emerging markets that this is now opening for them to expand overseas. Another interesting thing I've noticed through my research is in the steel industry and other industries, there's a diversification of markets, there's also a diversification of industries. So steel companies, in addition to moving into other international markets, are also expanding into areas such as real estate and even as diverse as pig farming. So it's kind of outside their traditional business model, but they're looking for ways to gain profits in a market when their core market is still relatively unprofitable. So we just looked at why Chinese companies are going global. There's a set of government motivations, there's a set of business motivations, but I think the real question we need to ask is, are they ready? There's a very big difference between having global aspirations and wanting to have international offices around the world, but it's another thing to be able to actually execute and do it. What I highlighted in my book are 5 key relationships that I think Chinese companies really need to master if they want to get this right. These are relationships with the government, both in China and then also in the host environments where they're investing. And it's a relationship with their employees overseas, their customers, the communities where they invest in, and then also understanding the right amount of capital they need to invest to get it right. So to give you an example, I wanted to highlight one story of a Chinese company that essentially did a fairly poor job managing these 5 relationships, so you can see how they come to play. So this is a company named Li Ning. They compete with Nike and Adidas in the athletic apparel space. Their founder, Li Ning, is a former Olympic athlete, and what you can see here is he had probably the best advertising opportunity of anyone in the world because he was hoisted up by rope during the 2008 Summer Olympics and ran in his branded sports gear all around the stadium for the world to see to light the cauldron. But what many people didn't know was 1 year later, after the 2008 Olympics, was Li Ning actually opened up a subsidiary in the United States to compete directly with Nike. It was in Portland, Oregon, which is where Nike's based. The strategy, though, was flawed from the outset. They went out with about 30 employees. They didn't really understand the market. Many of the decisions were being made centrally in Beijing. So the team back in the US were really primarily order takers. They weren't really taking part in international strategy. They were just doing what the Beijing office said. Additionally, they mismanaged their employees. There was one individual in particular who was promoted from being a product manager in Oregon by the local staff. They wanted him to take on a global role in China. When the Chinese team found out about this, they decided, we don't want him in Beijing. And he ended up getting into a legal battle with them, and it got very messy. But I think the thing that was most striking of their attempt to enter the US was their fundamental lack of understanding of the American consumer market. So Time Magazine did a very deep and detailed investigative report into the company, and they went into the retail store. And they talked a little bit about what are the products that are being sold there. So they were selling things that were more common, so things like basketball sneakers or running shoes. But then a lot of the products were very surprising. There were things like badminton rackets, ping pong tables, things like kung fu gear. So things that are very not in line with an American consumer, really demonstrated the fact that they didn't really understand the American consumer market. So as a result, they pulled out. But one of the things that was tough is that this didn't just impact their ability to perform overseas, but this hurt their market share back at home. Before they left, they were a strong competitor against Nike and Adidas. When they returned, they lost a ton of market share and were not only competing with them, but also other local competitors like Anta and other kind of Chinese athletic apparel firms. So I think this is a model that a company like maybe Alibaba needs to think about. A company in a very different industry and a company that we've talked about in the media for the last few months. Jack Ma, who you see here, the founder of the firm, he told people and he told media in Hong Kong just a couple weeks ago that after their IPO, the firm intends to expand aggressively into Europe and into the United States. And despite having this aspiration, I don't know if this is really the right time for Alibaba to do so. I think the firm is certainly more capable to expand into the US or expand into Europe than a company like Li Ning. But I think the real question is around timing. What's the opportunity cost going to be if it goes overseas right now? So just to put it in perspective, if you're in China, Tmall, the company's B2C platform right now, has a little more than 50% market share. So it's a significant market leader. Its C2C platform, that's the equivalent of eBay, Taobao, has over 90% market share. So there's no question they're dominant right now. But in reality, there are so many people that aren't even online yet, and of the ones that are online in China, only about 30% are making purchases online. So the room to grow is tremendous. Meanwhile, there's companies like Baidu, like Tencent, competitors that are trying to come up with competitive products to potentially, challenge Alibaba over the long term. And if Alibaba were to focus primarily on China, I have no question they could easily beat the other competitors. But if they do lose focus and focus too much overseas right now at the expense of their operations in China, it could be a different story. So it's just something to think about as you look at these companies and their ambitions to go abroad. The timing might not be right, as well as their capabilities might not be right. So back to the 5 relationships I introduced a moment ago. The first relationships that Chinese companies need to figure out is managing their relationship with the government. You see here a Chinese company that's looking to go overseas for the first time really has to navigate a complex web of government agencies to understand the right way to go global. And that's going to depend on their ownership structure, their industry, the size of their company. And these can be agencies such as MOFCOM, the NDRC, even to get their money outside of China because the renminbi isn't readily convertible into foreign currencies. They have to work with an agency like SAFE. That said, the government is working hard to make their regulatory environment for outward investment more transparent. So the NDRC in April loosened its regulations, and then just 2 days ago, MOFCOM did the same thing. But it's still, for an investor that hasn't expanded overseas before for the first time, it could be a very complex process to navigate, and there's not a clear guidebook that says this is how you should get from step A to step B. Then interestingly, once the Chinese companies enter an international market, if they enter the EU, they don't always know who to go to for support. They're used to turning to the government. They think the government's going to be able to give them the answer to all of their questions. But in reality, they often need to rely on third parties or professional service firms that they're not accustomed to working with. What you see here is a survey that the EU Chamber of Commerce did in China about, I think it was in 2013. They interviewed about 71 Chinese investors who had set up operations in the EU, and they asked them about a series of questions and challenges that they faced when operating here. And many of them had to deal with not knowing who to go to when it came to entering the markets, not really understanding the regulations, not understanding how to open their offices. And all of these are things where they may have worked with government bodies or local officials to understand where they should invest in the past. Just put in perspective, if you're a foreign company and you want to invest in China, the NDRC has an annual book that shows all the projects and areas and regions that are encouraged for investment. And they're looking almost for something similar when Chinese companies go overseas. So what you have is a situation where many Chinese companies are reluctant to employ professional services firms in the management consulting, public relations, tax and advisory to really help them get throughout that process. So there tends to be many mishaps, and I think the ones you see that are successes today are the Chinese companies that are relying on that third-party support. Next relationship is company to employees. So what you see on the screen here is a challenge that any company going global faces. It's how do you balance being a centralized organization that has global capabilities versus having international offices that are on the ground where you can respond faster to client requests and incorporate their insights into your products. The challenge is that you always need to optimize scale, because if your regional office goes and does its own thing, it doesn't leverage the fact that it's actually part of a much larger company. But I think this is exacerbated with Chinese companies, at least the ones that I've spoken to. There tends to be much more of a hands-on approach from the management, especially at the senior management level, where they want control. Just to give you one example, during my research, I interviewed they were general managers or vice presidents for Europe or the Americas for Chinese companies. And at the very beginning of my research, they all told me a fairly similar story. They were really excited. They said they had a giant company that was well-resourced in China. They had very big plans to go global, and they were really excited to be the ones to take it into Europe or take it into the United States. 3 years later, when I completed my research, I went back to many of them, and a lot of them were not in their positions anymore. They were either fired or they had proactively left the company. And the reasons that they gave me when I spoke to them again were things such as they didn't have the management autonomy that they needed to actually get the job done. They knew what they needed to do to manage their business, but they didn't actually have the management authority from the senior management in China to be able to make those decisions. A lot of times, they had to verify many of their decisions with the corporate headquarters, and then just from a very tactical level, they get phone calls at all hours of the night during Chinese times. But the thing that was very clear to me was they weren't just foreign faces that were hired. These weren't just people from Europe or people from North America that were a friend of a chairman that was hired. These were people that were industry veterans. They had 10, 20, 30 years of experience in those industries. So in reality, they knew and they had the skills of what it would take to get their jobs done. The challenge, though, is that they couldn't do it. And that was a big finding for me, which is not only do Chinese companies need to hire the right people on the ground, but they have to have senior managers back at their corporate headquarters that understand their local environment, where their firms are operating, and are able to set realistic expectations for their employees, and also make sure that their team back at headquarters has realistic expectations for the market, whether that be growth, size, or just the level of, or just the regulatory environment. The next relationship is company to consumers. So this is going to vary depending on whether it's a B2C company or a B2B company. On the B2C side, when it comes to managing actual consumers, I think there's a perception among marketers. So I interviewed people who are in the marketing profession, advertising, public relations, all across the board, who had been in China for 10 or 20 years. And when I was talking with them, some of the key themes that came about is that Chinese companies tend to attach marketing to that next product launch. It's not around building a long-term strategic asset of a brand. And so as a result, there's not a lot of investment in understanding their consumer insights and then building products that meet their needs. There's actually a joke from a PR professional, and I'm not sure if I fully agree with it, but he said that for many Chinese companies, branding is just getting a new logo. Advertising is buying ad placements on China Central Television, and PR stands for pay the reporter. And I don't think that's necessarily true, but I do think that it does demonstrate a general lack of emphasis among many Chinese companies on marketing and building a strong brand. On the other side, on the B2B side, it came from a conversation I had with an individual named Yuan Haiying. He used to be in the Chinese government, and now he has his own advisory firm in Beijing. And he told me, Joel, he said, Joel, when you think about Chinese companies and the way they look at contracts, you need to recognize that the Chinese executives are coming from a 熟人社会, or a familiar people society. So in a familiar people society, it's the interpersonal relationships that are binding those contracts. It's not the pen to paper. But it's very important that as these companies are going into international markets, especially more sophisticated markets with stringent regulatory processes like those of Europe, like those in the United States, that they rely on contracts, because contrary to popular belief, when these firms are overseas, they're overseas subsidiaries and are therefore bound by the same rules and regulations as any other European or American firm. Now we have the company to community. So a lot of Chinese companies want to continue to do what they've always done very well, which is focus on execution, focus on sales, and get their products to market. But when you're entering an overseas market, there's a lot of potentially negative perceptions of Chinese products and kind of made in China goods. To give you one example, last year there was a company called Shanghai International. It's one of China's largest pork producers. And they announced that they wanted to purchase Smithfield Foods, a company in the United States, another pork producer. But at the same time they made that announcement, there's also massive news headlines about thousands of dead pigs floating along the Huangpu River. So if you're a consumer in the United States, you open up your front page of your newspaper and you see headlines about dead pigs in China. And then you turn to the business section and then you see that a Chinese company wants to buy a marquee American pork producer. There's certainly going to be thoughts in their head of, is this going to be safe for me? Is this going to be safe for my family? And whether or not those are justified, they're naturally going to come to mind. So it's important for Chinese companies as they place these international investments that they're not just going to set up an office. They need to be willing to engage the communities and present themselves as a positive economic stakeholder. This is just one example of something a company can do, which is a wind energy firm, Goldwind. They made a big donation to a German university, which is kind of the first step. I think the way that you're really going to see change here is that as these Chinese companies invest in these overseas markets and they stay there for 2, 5, even a decade, when they're there for a significant amount of time and people can see with their own eyes that they're adding jobs, they're adding tax revenues, they're adding all these tertiary benefits, that's when you'll be able to see that they're a true beneficial contributor to the economy. But in the short term, Chinese companies really need to be aware that they have to manage their reputation just as much as they're trying to seek out commercial gains. The last relationship is fairly straightforward. It's the whole idea of company to capital. Chinese companies need to be willing to invest the right amount of money and place the significant investment up front to guarantee the success of their business. They need to incentivize their employees at international standards, and they need to be ready to invest in their business over the long term for future growth. So those are the 5 relationships, and we'll look at those into a couple of case studies that I'll share in just a moment. But first, I just want to talk about a couple of the paths that Chinese companies are taking. Well, there are many paths that Chinese companies have to go out and go global. M&A is certainly one of the things that we read a lot about. It's what the Financial Times obviously covered quite a bit the other day. And it's certainly one of these things where I think regardless of what country you're from, you're going to have significant issues in a cross-border M&A deal. But I think there's about 3 things I want to highlight here that are actually particularly nuanced from the Chinese perspective. So first, Chinese companies tend to pay significantly more when going for the outbound investment. So in North America, for example, they're paying about a 33% premium on their outward investments, on their outward M&A deals. This can be due to the fact that for many of these companies, it's their first time expanding overseas. At the same time, it's also due to the fact that there is that complex web of government agencies, and for those of you that do business in China, that's a lot of red stamps that need to be collected, and that's a lot of time that can be stalled and potentially damage the success of the deal. The management visits can be much more complex. Even something as mundane as a visa can be hard to get in time, and then some things like just the idea of buying a company just a few months after meeting the management team can be very difficult for a Chinese investor. And then last is the post-merger integration phase can be very complex. You're merging 2 very different cultures, you're merging 2 very different organizations into a single entity. And that's more of the hands-on approach that we talked about with Lenovo and their management team. Where I've seen companies be very successful is taking more of a hands-off approach, which is they find an acquisition target in Europe or the United States that has a very good management team, they have a good product offering, they have good processes, but because of economic conditions, they're in debt and they need capital. So rather than go to a private equity firm, they turn to the acquisition target turns to a Chinese investor that gives them money, doesn't replace the management team, but over time learns how the business works and gradually takes a much stronger role within the company. But at the beginning, they're really just there to learn and see how the business operates. So the real questions are, what are the costs and what are the benefits of Chinese investment as these firms come into the US and come into Europe? This is a quote from economic reformer Deng Xiaoping. He says, 打开窗户，新鲜空气会进来，苍蝇也会飞进来. When you open a window, fresh air will come in, but so will some flies. And what he means by that, what he said by that was really with with foreign companies entering China. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind as you look at Chinese companies going abroad, because while there will certainly be many benefits associated with that, there's bound to be some negative externalities. And as we think about this topic, it's about how do you maximize those benefits while mitigating those potential risks? And a lot of that has to do with the policy and regulations you have in place to screen those investments. So some of those negative risks or the concerns that people have about Chinese investment, they range depending on whether you're the government, a corporation, a consumer. They'll also vary depending on what perspective you have. So where I'm from in the United States, there tends to be a lot of worry here in the government perspective. It's cybersecurity, national security. They're always top of mind when it comes to Chinese investments in the US. Whereas I think in the European perspective, it's probably more on this side. So things such as labor issues, consumer standards, environmental costs. Is the Chinese company going to come in here, purchase a factory, shut it down, and then send it back to China? These are the things that go through people's heads. And I think it can be a little bit more complex than just right or wrong, and that's what this example from Greece can actually demonstrate to us. So the company Costco is a Chinese state-owned shipping firm, and this company they made one of the biggest investments in the EU a few years ago. And depending on whether you're looking at it from a corporate perspective or whether you're looking at it from a social perspective, you'll have a very different answer as to whether or not it was a positive or a negative. So from a corporate perspective, the company completely turned around their side of the port. There's still a Greek side of the port, and there's still a Chinese side of the port. And the Chinese side of the port is much more profitable. It's much more productive. They brought in so much more cargo than the Greek side ever had. The challenge is, though, is when you look at it from a social perspective. So when Costco went in, they fired all unionized labor. They stepped on a lot of toes, and they decreased the wages of all the people that were working for them. So from a social perspective, it was actually quite damaging. It was actually something that if I were a Greek dock worker, I would not be very happy with. But if you look at just from a completely objective economic standpoint, they've done a very good job. On the other side, from a consumer perspective, if you look at the company Bright Food, they had purchased Weetabix in the UK a couple years back. A few years prior to that, they wanted to acquire Yoplait in France. Interestingly, they were in a bidding war with General Mills, and General Mills didn't even bid as much as Bright Food did, but because Yoplait felt that General Mills would be a more responsible investor, they went with General Mills, even though I think Bright Foods outbid them by an absurd amount, like millions and millions of dollars. But it was because there was a lot more trust that the U.S. side would be able to fulfill their agreement and be able to more effectively manage that firm, rather than bring in an inexperienced Chinese investor that people had not heard about, which again reemphasizes why they need to be focusing on their reputation and branding, because that will help kind of avoid this from happening. The last thing we'll talk about is just the benefits. So yes, there are risks, but there are also some very real benefits that can come. And I think many of you that are here today that are looking to bring in investment are looking to achieve these goals right here. These are things like job creation, even just a greenfield investment. So when a new factory is opened, it's not just the employees that work in that factory that are adding to the economic activity. It's the people, the contractors that are coming in to build the buildings, it's the tax advisors, it's the logistic networks that are starting to get built up. All of these are jobs and economic activity that are created from just this one investment. Also the improved infrastructure. We'll talk in a moment about a company that's been able to revive certain industries as well. In addition to the tax revenues, there's also the idea of new market access in China. So there's several companies in China right now that are taking part in investment strategies that are helping them gain capabilities from overseas that will actually strengthen their position and satisfy a need back in China. So one example here is Geely's acquisition of Volvo. While it gave them a premier brand and it gave them a foothold overseas, it also helped them tap into China, which is now the world's #1 auto market. And you're seeing that also with some of these lesser-known firms in the automotive supplier space that are getting bought by Chinese companies. Additionally, in a very different area, something like wine consumption. You're seeing wine vineyards in Bordeaux and Latin America get purchased by Chinese state-owned firms. There's one company in particular, Fosun, Chinese is Fuxing, and this company, they very clearly stated their investment strategy is they want to identify trends in China that are not being met, that are kind of growth areas, and then invest overseas. So those are things like wine, they've invested in vineyards. They bought the Greek firm Folly. They invested in Club Med, and they also have some other divisions as well. So it's a very large conglomerate with some very ambitious plans. The last area is just corporate philanthropy, and it's this whole idea that as Chinese companies expand further, they're going to continue to invest more responsibly in the communities where they're investing. This is something I think is a bit far off at the time. I don't see a lot of companies doing this, but it's something that I would hope would be an ultimate outcome of their investments. So just last, here's an example of Waldrich Coburg. It's a German company that was purchased by a company from Beijing, a state-owned firm with a very creative name. It was called Beijing #1. It's an industrial machinery company, and they purchased Waldrich actually after being a customer of Waldrich for about 20, 30 years. Waldrich was in a similar position to some of those firms I just talked about. They had a very good management team, they had a great product, they had customers around the world, but they were in a tremendous amount of debt. So Beijing #1 came in, they invested $40 million over the first 5 years, and completely turned around the company. And they did not replace one senior manager with the Chinese face. They gradually started involving themselves more in the business and then gradually opened up the Chinese market for them. And here's another example from France where a company, Weichai, went out and helped turn around a similar company in the marine motor space. And the reason why we're looking at examples from 2005 and 2009 instead of 2014 is it takes time to see how these things play out. We are very early in this trend, and so as much as we want to talk about some of the bigger investments we've seen in 2013, 2014, we're not going to know the true outcome of this for many years to come. And that just kind of brings me to my final point, which is Chinese companies going global has a lot of room to grow. We are at the very beginning of this trend. Chinese companies operating businesses really only started in 1978 with the reform and opening. Chinese companies going global didn't really begin until the late 90s, early 2000s when some of these state-owned firms started making these resource plays. And we didn't even start seeing some, what I think is going to be the new wave, these private companies placing investments until the last 2 or 3 years. So the running room is long, and there's a lot more of the story to be told. And I'm just happy to be part of this, to be able to see how it develops. But thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.